Hi, everyone. It's really, really great to be sharing some space together today to talk about some work that we've been doing in partnership with both Mass Cultural Council and Mass Development for a number of years now, and is really just a great piece of work to be able to do locally. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit more in a few minutes once I get into sort of NFF's piece of this work. This work is really something that's in partnership across a lot of different entities. But before I get into our side of the work, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just talk about what it is that we're here for today. And so we're here talking about a service called a systems replacement plan. This is something that, again, takes a lot of different folks, a lot of different sort of skills and expertise that could be really helpful for folks who are managing a facility as part of their work as a nonprofit. And so we've got a lot of those different folks on the phone today. And so we're going to start with an introduction from Jay and from Miranda at MCC, who are going to really talk about where this fits into sort of their grant making program and how they think of the systems replacement plan as a really important part of their support for cultural facilities throughout the Commonwealth. Then I'm going to jump back in and talk a little bit about Nonprofit Finance Fund, who we are, what our role is within this work. I'm going to pass it over to our facilities consultant, Joe Olive, who will talk a little bit about where he comes in to talk to look through the building. He'll pass it back to me to talk about some of the financial pieces. And then we're going to hear from some folks who we've had the wonderful opportunity of working with in the past. Folks who have experienced this work, who have used this work, who are still using the deliverables of this work in order to do their work in culture in their organizations. We are going to have some time for questions. That's one of the goals of coming together today, is to give folks the opportunity to ask their questions of all of us, but we are going to try and hold those until the end. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat throughout, and we'll be kind of bringing those all together to again have various of us answer those at the end. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jay and Miranda to talk a little bit about MCC.
Great. Thanks, Robert. My name is Jay Padgett. I'm the program director for the Cultural Facilities Fund, and my partner in this work at the Cultural Council is Miranda Cook. So we know many of you, and many of you I think we'll get to know if we don't already. This fund has an application that's open now. And we have 3 different types of grants that are listed here. Capitals to implement the work. Feasibility and technical assistance is planning, planning from a number of angles. And then the systems replacement plan is the 3rd grant, and that's the one that's the subject of the conversation today. Historically, this fund's been around since 2007, and when it started, the SRP, I'll refer to the systems replacement plan as the SRP. We didn't have that as an option, but it came to our attention pretty quickly that having a capital needs assessment would be a really great way for us as stewards of public money to try to make informed decisions about funding capital projects, because a lot of times having context of this project that you are applying for and why this is important now, having some sort of context gives us some confidence that you see a global picture, and then from that global picture, you prioritize projects going forward. So hopefully we get a twofer with this, in that it helps us get to know you in a relatively short period of time and the capital kind of needs you have, but then hopefully internally it's a really useful tool for you to map out and plan capital projects, even if there's staffing changes and things like that. We can go to the next slide. This is just a heads up that the application that's open right now is due in just less than 4 weeks. And it is due on December 14th, and it's an electronic submission. So the electronic application will be open till 11:59 p.m. Next slide, please. Very briefly, if you are a nonprofit with a 501c3 designation and you're primarily concerned with the arts, humanities, or interpretive sciences, you are eligible for this program. Municipalities and colleges are also eligible, and they have different requirements per the statutory environment that created this fund. Those are listed here. I'm not going to go into them in great detail right now because I really do want to get on with the heart and soul of this webinar, which is the SRP. So next slide. This is what we're going to be talking about today. We pulled this slide from our presentation, and this is just a very quick overview of the types of things that the SRP will look at so that you have a pretty thorough understanding of what's happening, quote, under the hood in your facility. I will note that the grant range is between $8,000 and $14,000, and it's a 1-to-1 match. So you put up half the money, we put up half the money, and that $8,000 to $14,000 range is there because there's a range of different types of facilities and sizes. So once you fill out the application, we'll work with you to determine the final price of the SRP. Next slide, please. This is going to be made available, these links, so that you can easily get to our application. And once again, don't forget that the deadline is coming up. So please, it's a hard deadline, so we can't extend that. That may be it for me. I wanted to just give you a little bit of an overview and definitely highlight the fact that you can apply for this grant if you're eligible right now. So Robert, I think I'm handing it back to you.
That's correct.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways for you to reach Miranda and I and ask questions beyond this webinar. And you can certainly do that through email, phone, or we have office hours twice a week. And all of this information is on our website.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Jay. Really appreciate you giving sort of the background and how this all came together, as well as what the process will be for folks to apply to participate in this. So quick introduction. I know I half introduced myself before, but wanted to give a little bit more context as to why I'm here, why I'm talking about this, and who we are. So again, my name's Robert. I'm a director on the consulting team at Nonprofit Finance Fund. We as an organization do a lot of different things, but all of it at its core is about supporting nonprofits, and specifically helping connect money with mission. So I, on the consulting team, work with leaders of nonprofits in thinking about how they use their money, how they get their money, and how they kind of connect that both to the impact that they're trying to have in the community, as well as their strategy as an organization. And so this is one piece that we do of a lot of different things. We as an organization, as you can see on this slide, we also offer financing to organizations, and that's how we as an organization ourselves got started. We are partnership, community engagement, and then we try and share out what we learn from doing all this type of work with nonprofits back out with the community, so that folks are able to use that knowledge again to advance their own mission. So before I get into the specifics of what a systems replacement plan is, I wanted to contextualize it within how we think about what does it just mean to run a facility as a nonprofit? Particularly, again, I come to this from a financial lens, but we know that that's only one piece of a much larger kind of mission-oriented piece. And so what I wanted to say that I think is obvious to everyone on this call, but hopefully can validate some of what you've experienced, is that facilities, especially in the cultural space, wind up being really core to the mission. It's hard to do a lot of the work that we do if we don't have a place to do it. And at the same time, sometimes they take away from the things that we really want to be doing, right? The things that we want to prioritize in our time. The reason that we came to this work in the first place probably was not to deal with the leaky roof or whatever it is. And so I just want to say from the beginning that this is often something that folks accidentally wind up doing, similar to the financial components. For the most part, people have to do it because it's the only way to do the work, but oftentimes it's taking away from other things that we want to do. It requires just a ton of time and really specific expertise in order to be able to manage a building. Oftentimes it requires dedicated funding and resources, sometimes that are really hard to find sources for, which is why I think it's so great that MCC is offering these specific grants around this. And it's really hard to plan for. And that's some of what we are hoping to address with the systems replacement plan, is to allow people from both sort of the operational building side as well as from the financial side, plan for the future of their facility. And so many organizations who engage in this type of work, they're kind of piecing it together day by day. Right? We wait until the roof starts leaking, and then we run out and try and find a grant to fix the leak that is in our roof. Right? For many organizations, because it's not where we want to focus our resources or focus our time, we get a lot of what we call deferred maintenance, things that maybe should have been taken care of a few years ago that we let sort of wait until we can't ignore it anymore. We have to deal with it. And then we scramble to go find the resources, the dollars that we need in order to do that work, in order to make that repair or the replacement in our facility. And so what we hope to do through this planning process is, again, have the knowledge about what is going to happen so that we can be ready to make those changes in the building, but also so that we can slowly over time build the financial resources, build the reserve that we need so that hopefully funds are available by the time we have to make that repair or replacement, rather than going to find funds after the fact. And so that's sort of core to our piece of this, is helping folks build that over time, again, so that they're prepared before any issues come up. And so just a base way that we think about that, just to add a little finance into this, which I know is not what anyone came here for, but just to add to it, when we think of financial health in general, we're thinking about what we call a business model, how we make and spend money in service of our mission, and then a capital structure. It's our savings, it's our net worth, it's what we have to devote to ourselves, again, without having to run and scramble to the other places. And so our hope is that this can be sort of a virtuous cycle in which, if we cover the full cost year to year of what it takes for us to do our work, that's going to involve putting away some money, right? Having some sort of surplus, bringing in a little bit more than we're spending in each year so that we can put away reserves. We could build up what we would call a healthy capital structure. We can build up, as part of that capital structure, a facilities reserve. We know how much money we need to put away every year so that we can have that money prepared, so that when that time comes that we need to make repairs, we need to make replacements, we can go ahead and do that ourselves, rather than, again, having to go out and search for funds in the moment. I know that this is not how most people run nonprofits. I know that this is a lot easier for me to put a little graphic together here than actually to do in real life. And so we include this one extra piece here, this idea of capital, to say this is not always going to be possible. We want to try, we want to prepare for it, but we know that sometimes, eventually, we're going to need some sort of big infusion of dollars that are specifically meant for these purposes. And that's where funders like MCC are really incredible in being able to provide those funds. And so I did include here, although given time, I'm not going to spend too much time here, but this will be a nice takeaway for folks of when we're starting out, especially again, when we come in and there's already a lot of that deferred maintenance, those things that just need to get done, here's some ideas for folks of ways that we can go and get that capital, ways that we can go and build those funds over time, both to address the immediate needs, as well as to go and start to build that fund that you can draw on year over year. So that's in general what we're trying to do here, right? We're trying to make sure that folks are prepared when they need to make repairs and replacements in their building, that they have the funds to do it, and that we can maintain buildings in their sort of current condition at a bare minimum before we even start thinking about improvements for the future. Because we know it's expensive over time to be able to do this. So this is where the SRP comes in as hopefully a valuable piece of being able to do this work, is that we want to know over a 20-year period, both what do we think is going to need to be repaired or replaced, as well as how much is it going to cost us and when are we going to need that money, right? And so it's not a perfect science, to be totally honest, right? There's always going to be a tree that falls, a storm that comes in, things are going to change. But to the best of our ability, we want to make sure that we're prepared for all of the things inside the building, outside the building, that are likely going to need to be repaired or replaced over that 20-year period. And so we start with what Joe's going to talk about in just a minute, of an assessment of how does everything stand today, right? What pieces do we need to potentially worry about for the future? Once we know what those pieces are, we start to cost that. We start to think about how much it's going to cost when, and then we help to build a plan for how are we going to make sure that the dollars are ready when we need them. So this is something that is available to organizations that own buildings. It can include folks that have a long-term lease and a responsibility for those repairs and replacements as well. Reasons to consider, and I'm not going to just kind of read this slide at you, but in our mind, a lot of it is on the planning side. We know that for most folks, though, planning is only half of it. Really, this is also a useful tool for being able to go out and fundraise, right? To be able to say to funders, we've had someone else come and tell us that we need this, right? We have this report from this outside group who says that over time, we're going to need this at this point and this at this point. And I think that's some of what Jay was talking about before from MCC's perspective. It's something that I'll ask, our former participants to talk about how they've used it as well, because other funders we've heard also really appreciate this, being able to sort of lay it out over time. So I'm going to push us forward. What does the SRP include? What is the systems replacement plan? Again, it's a look at the whole building. Joe will go into a little bit more detail than what's on here in just a minute, but it's a look at all of the systems, the envelope, mechanical systems, flooring, electrical, life safety. It's telling us how old is it, how much longer until we think it's going to be needed a repair or replacement, and then again, how much do we think it's going to cost? And so I'm going to pass over to Joe to talk about that first aspect of it, right? How is he looking at the building's perspective. And then I'll come back in and talk a little bit about how we take some of the data that Joe and his team is putting together, and help create that financial planning tool. So go ahead, Joe.
Thank you, Robert. So I'm going to give everybody an overview of how we approach it. I think in the past, over the years, we've seen these type of assessments or system replacement plans basically were direct replacement of equipment, building envelope, components, etc. That's great, but with the ever-changing energy efficiency markets, with the handicap accessibility, we've expanded our assessment to kind of consider, and it is for consideration, other approaches to replacement as well as direct replacement. So next slide. Our overview for the SRP process, and this is key because a lot of these buildings are much older. Some of them are landmark, is historic, and documentation is a challenge. I've gone as far as counting roof shingles to determine the size of a building. You know, so whatever it takes, we'll get it done. But any documentation that you do have would be very much appreciated. It helps us do a better job. Approach the site visit. We'll go to that shortly. SRP spreadsheet. I put a sample in so you can see how we want to present it to NFF. And I think, Robert, you do share that spreadsheet with the end user? Excellent. We've gone as far over the years. We've been doing this for about 15 years now for NFF. And we've seen that for me, to really get accurate numbers, we've actually added a separate takeoff sheet, tabs, etc., for different components to really give you the detail that we're using to determine cost, etc. And then I'm going to go through one example in particular about the usefulness of the SRP from a client that brought us on to help them manage the process. And I'll give you some really good examples of why, if you can use the SRP, this is the reason you should. So we'll go to that. Next slide. So the documentation, and this is the challenge, because a lot of times these buildings don't have as-built drawings or even drawings that provide or are available for that matter. A survey, which I didn't put on here, is great. At least it gives me the outer dimensions of the building if it's available. And anything that you can provide documenting when the roof was replaced, when any of the items or components were replaced, for example, or placed in service, that's helpful. I mean, we've gone as far as taking labels off or taking photos of labels off of mechanical equipment, which the serial number and the model number give us the information of the size and year of replacement in most cases. So we'll do whatever it takes to determine placed in service. If it's not placed in service or we don't have the information available, we'll speculate as best we can based on the condition at the time of the inspection. Next slide, Robert. Am I talking too fast, by the way? I have a tendency to do that. Okay, good. This approach to the site visit is to actually, I like to sit down with the client to discuss their objectives for the SRP, because the objectives vary based on the condition of the building, based on the objectives of the end user. So I usually allocate about a half an hour, and then also to address any immediate concerns about the buildings. You know, the roof is 30 years old. We're having some issues with it, etc. We will need to access everywhere possible: roof, attic, mechanical rooms, etc. If it turns out that access is not available, we may try to ask some questions, get some ideas, do the best we can to understand what may be needed down the road, whether it be documentation or a return trip for access. We take a lot of photos and move quickly. My approach, or our approach, to these site visits is to keep it as minimally invasive as possible, especially in buildings that may be occupied. We've had buildings with classrooms, etc., and we don't want to interfere with the operations of the entity. So we'll move quickly through, take a lot of photos, and then have an exit interview and possibly ask any questions on observations. Sometimes the client wants to know what I've observed, and if I have some general observations that I can share just from the site visit, I will. And I find that's helpful because in some cases I've shared my observation and I've gotten feedback that, oh yeah, we're going to replace that next month, or yes, we are concerned about that, and it's helpful. Our photos are automatically uploaded to a cloud server, Company Cam it's called, and I have a staff that downloads it right into our spreadsheet and starts to put the spreadsheet together. What has come from that is an inventory of the photos coming in, where let's say there was an issue and we didn't get photos or the photos didn't upload, they'll reach out to me right away while I'm on site. Say, hey, we don't see the front facade, and I'll go back and take photos. One of the key components, which I mentioned at the beginning, is we're looking at energy efficiency for the buildings. You may have some 20-year-old mechanical equipment that is not efficient, and there may be options for energy efficiency or handicap accessibility, alternate options for replacement. We will actually give you recommendations for alternate options, as well as, in many cases, if an engineer, an architect, or consultant is required, we'll even estimate the possible fee required for them to come in and go much further with this. So it's a matter of identifying it, providing a cost, and then recommendation of the design professional or engineer that you may want to bring in with the fee so you can build it into your budgeting. Next slide. Thank you. The spreadsheet is pretty comprehensive. It's evolved over the 15 years we've been doing this. We put in a lot of photos, and I've had great response on the photos because it's clear what we're looking at and what we're providing a recommendation, what component we're providing the recommendation for. This identifies, and I won't read through every one of them, this shows you how we go through and identify each of the components through this process. But what I'd like to focus on is the recommendations. Immediate replacement, that's pretty straightforward. We have the year of placed in service, the useful life, and we can tell you year 5, year 10, it can be replaced. Or if it's in poor condition and beyond useful life, immediate replacement. Where we have a gray area is as needed. And I'll give you an example. Many buildings have 20, 30, 50 interior doors. They're all functioning. They don't have to be replaced, but we'll give you the cost to replace them all as needed. That way you can budget for all of it, or you can budget, a unit cost as needed over the 20-year capital reserve. So you're not really spending the money unnecessarily. And for consideration, that's usually the alternate options that we're going to recommend. It's for consideration. We provide a cost to it so that you can say, well, that's way out of line. There's no way we can do that. Or compare it to what a direct replacement might be and go, this is worth considering. Next slide. And I'll make one statement from that previous slide, is that we tailor our cost to the region or the geographic area. We do these assessments all over the country, and we actually research the unit costs for each of the areas so that when we come in, we're not giving you cost from one metropolitan area for a lesser rural area. It makes no sense. When we do assess the costs, we have a low cost and a high cost. We take the high cost. I'd rather budget high than have you do all your capital reserve planning on a number that wouldn't be sufficient to actually complete the work. This is the spreadsheet that we provide to NFF. We go in great detail, photos, left to right, building component, our description and observations of the building component, age. If we don't know the age, we may put unknown or assumed 5 years, whatever it might be. estimated useful life that comes from a table. The one that we use is a Fannie Mae table. We prefer that. It seems to be the most accurate. We will adjust or tailor the useful life depending on the area. For example, I was out in California on an assessment, and what I could tell was the roof seemed to age much quicker due to the heat than you would see in the Northeast. Then our recommendations. We try to get into decent detail with the recommendations so that you understand what our recommendations cover. Next column is your replacement. It's basically math between estimated useful life and age, quantity, unit that's used to determine the cost, unit cost, and then total cost. This way you can adjust it. Let's say you have a roof system, multiple roof systems, or I should say one type of roof system, but on different areas of the building, and one seems to be much more worn than the other. You may say, okay, let's take this calculation and allocate it to that one area, and let's budget for that area for 2 years out and the other area for 5 years out. It helps you do the math as you need. Next slide, Robert. So to help us be more accurate in this spreadsheet, we've developed this system of tabs. The takeoff usually carries the cost from each of the other tabs to the takeoff. The takeoff then goes to the spreadsheet. And if you want to go to the next, here we go. This is the takeoff sheet. This was a complicated project because it had so many different types of windows. So we normally don't do this if you have the same type of window throughout the building. We just take the total square footage to calculate replacement cost. But this was so complex, the only way I could see really estimating it appropriately was to do it in this fashion. Next two slides, I think, are still the takeoff sheet. Gives you an idea what we show and what carries to the SRP spreadsheet. Now this is, for example, exterior wood trim. We actually estimate the trim on the building, value it, price it out, includes removal and repair, painting if necessary. We do this for decks, railings, etc. This gives us a cost that will carry, if you go back to the, I don't know if I have it on the takeoff. Go forward 2 more tabs. I think it's the second one. Next one. There you go. You'll see exterior woodwork. Refer to the exterior woodwork tab. There's the allowance. And then when we go to the spreadsheet, we'll get into detail at what's included in the allowance, and you can refer to the tab for the detail. Next tab. Next one. There you go. Mechanical equipment. This is our nemesis because half the equipment don't have labels. The documentation is not available. We have to, in some cases, in this particular one, the ream units on the furnaces, we had to actually try to figure out an approximation of when it was installed and the size of the units based on the area. We actually do the math on the area that it's servicing. So again, the more information we have, the better, but if not, we will do our best to incorporate our knowledge and experience in the SRP. Next. Okay, so this is one that I was talking to Robert about last week. We rarely see how the SRP is utilized once it's delivered, from our perspective. But we had the fortune of working with a client who didn't have the resources or the people on staff to help roll it out. So they brought us in I want to say about 2019 or so to help roll it out. And we had done the SRP in 2017. One of the concerns I had was steel was rusting on the building. The sidewalk vault was on the verge of collapse. At least they took the initiative to put temporary shoring in. We went out and got contractors in to get pricing and scope, etc. It's just now getting done. We're in 2023. Had we not gotten involved, I don't know if there would have been temporary shoring put in place, and we could have had a real challenge on our hands. The roof replacement, which it was interesting because our SRP, and I'm not saying we're always right, but what I am saying is it gives you a guideline. We said replace replace the roof by 2020. Based on the visible condition, we didn't have placed in service timeline. With that said, we were involved with a renovation of the top floor of the building. Renovated it. It's been beautiful finishes. All of a sudden, the roof started to leak. Now there's been a lot of change in administration and staff within this organization. So there's no history from one to the next. As a matter of fact, they didn't even have the SRP from when it was given to them, provided to them years prior. So we provided the SRP, and then we started to take steps to get the roof replaced. The roof destroyed a lot of the new finishes. So it's a matter of priority and reserve, because they had to run around at the last minute to get the funds to put the roof in, which was time and additional damage. So this is our firsthand experience in how it was not used and what the end result was. I know Robert's got some folks that we did the SRPs for who did a great job utilizing it, and that's great. I'm looking forward to hearing that, actually. So next slide. That's it. So that's our presentation. I hope it helped.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Joe.
Robert.
Yeah. So I'm gonna jump back in and we'll keep moving because we always got to keep to time. So once Joe completes his assessment with his team, gets that whole long list of different systems, different mechanicals, etc., we'll have that ready for when do we expect different parts of the building to need to be repaired or replaced, and how much is it likely to cost in today's dollars. So Joe will send that over to us. We'll share that with the organization. And then we ourselves will take that initial information and start inputting that into our tool. So I'm going to show a couple different pieces of this tool, but the idea is, to Joe's point before, this is a plan that lasts 20 years. We want to make sure that it's usable because we do our best, right, to predict the future, but no one can 100% predict the future. We don't know how teams are going to change. We don't know how the weather is going to change or the climate is going to change. And so we want to make sure that this is something that you know how to use moving forward, so that you can make adjustments. So this is that same data that Joe just showed in his version. We take it and put it into our tool. This is just the basic input. With that same information, and we'll know in what year we expect each of the individuals to need a replacement. Various parts of the HVAC system, exterior woodwork, etc. This is just an example here. Based on all of that information, the tool is going to automatically move those costs into different years based on when we expect it needs to be repaired or replaced. The other thing that we're going to do in that process of moving those dollars across the 20-year period is adjust for inflation. This is, again, intended to be a relatively malleable tool. And so you will have the opportunity to talk with an NFF consultant about how conservative do you want to be on inflation, right? Do we think it's going to be as bad as it's been these last few years in the future? Do we want to be really conservative and have it be a little bit higher? Or do we want to maybe bring it down and assume that we'll be able to find the additional money if we need? That's part of the conversation. The other thing that we'll do in conversation is talk about, especially those first few. What we often see is that, again, because folks haven't necessarily done this before, they might get a whole long list of things that in theory should happen in the first year. It may not be possible to find X number of dollars. I'm not going to make up a big number and scare people, but it might not be possible to find all of that in the first year. And so we'll work with folks to prioritize. We'll move a little bit where we need to make it realistic for folks to actually be able to make the repairs, make the replacements, sometimes bunching things together a little bit, and think about it that. And as a result, what we'll get on the bottom here is a total. So that hopefully we'll know in advance approximately in 2030 this example organization would need about $195,000 worth of repairs or replacements in that year. The next year, they'll probably need a lot less, then a little bit more, then a little bit less. And so again, we'll know in total how much are we expecting that that organization is going to need to be able to pay out to keep up with those repairs or replacements. This is a lot of numbers that I'll explain. I wanted to show you what it looks like, but it also is going to come in graphs, which I think will be a little bit more helpful. Automatically, what the tool generates is how much do you need to put away today and every year in the future in order to make sure that by the time you need the money, it's in the account. So this starting point, this generated savings says if you need $100,000 10 years from now, we're going to save $10,000 every year in order to get it. And then we're going to add all of those up to say how much do we need to save every year. So what this winds up doing is just as a starting point, we already start saving for year 20 in year 1. For many organizations, that's not possible, right? We know that you're not worrying about 20 years, you're worrying about next month for the most part. And so we work with folks to then think about what is a realistic plan given your organization's budget, given your organization's business model, to spread the savings in a way that makes sense year over year, while also making sure that every single year you end with something in the bank account, meaning you have the money prepared for when those costs are likely to hit. So we'll have that conversation. We'll do some of that work of spreading things across. Some organizations, it might make sense to have it be a really consistent amount. Others prefer to approach this that every 5 years, we'd like to have a capital campaign. How much should we have our targets be for those capital campaigns in those years? So we'll talk a little on that strategy side of it as well. And then we'll generate a final report that includes graphs like this. So in this graph, this green bar is our ending reserve balance. Our purplish bar here is how much we think we should be putting away each year, how much we should be saving each year. And our orange bar is the costs that we expect to do each year. So this is just an example, but it's a fairly common example, I would say, in which in the first couple of years, there's again a lot of things that have been left that need to be taken care of. And so in those first years, we're just looking at are we able to bring in enough money to cover the cost in each of those years? We account in these calculations if you already have money put away in reserve, we'll include that. We'll include if you're getting any interest on those reserves as well. And so as a result, in these first couple of years, they covered their costs and the reserve stayed relatively steady. After that, we were able to figure out that if every single year they put away $50,000, adjusted for inflation, and have it be a very consistent, predictable, repeatable line in their budget, that they'd be able to build the reserves over time enough that by the time the big cost hits, they have the money. And then they're going to build it again and then be able to pay it, and then build it again and be able to pay it, and flatten out, even it out. So again, you know, every single year, $50,000 may be way, way more than it is for your organization, but you know with consistency how much you're going to need to either fundraise for or have as a surplus to your budget in order to make sure that those dollars are always there. So we include that in a report, which we then will be able to share out with stakeholders of your choice. Oftentimes that's the board. Oftentimes folks will wind up taking the report and giving it to a funder as well. We'll also include there just some information around what it is that's going to cost the most. So in this case, the exterior woodwork is where a lot of work needs to be done. But we'll get a sort of breakdown of what those are and what the sort of immediate repairs and replacements are that folks need to think about. But again, this will go over a 20-year period. We'll be able to do it both as a presentation, as well as you'll leave with that final presentation, which can be shared with funders, as well as, again, that malleable tool, that working tool that you'll know how to use so that over time, as priorities shift, as fundraising shifts, as things potentially change, given all the uncertainty in the world, you'll be able to edit that. You'll be able to use that over time to continue to think about what these needs are likely to look like. So overall, once we start, and I will admit it can take quite some time to start, but once we start, it takes about 3 months. So before we start, there's a whole state process. So you'll apply again by December 14th, I think it was. The state will get back to you next year. Once you get the grant, there is a matching process. There is a process of entering into an agreement with the funder, who's Mass Development. Then there's sort of all the paperwork stuff. Admittedly, that can sometimes take a while. It's a state process. But once all the bureaucracy sort of gets through and we start, we hope usually it'll take about the 3-month period. So we'll have an introductory call with all the stakeholders on the call. Joe will come out and do the inspection he spoke about before. He'll compile all of the data that he was talking about before and send it to us. We'll build the tool customized. And then here we said about 1 to 3 calls. So it depends on how often, how much time you're willing to put on the calls and between the calls. So sometimes it can spread out a little bit. Sometimes it's a little bit quicker. Usually 1 to 3. Sometimes it could be a few more. And then we put together that final presentation and deliver it to you and to your board. And that's sort of the whole process. So hopefully this gives some insight into its use and what it looks like. And I'm going to pass it over to Rich first to talk a little bit about his experience in going through this and using this with his organization, Joy of Music. Rich, your audio is a little bit off. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Rich, if you wouldn't mind, would you mind calling in with your phone? And I'm going to ask Lucy to go first, and we'll see if we can get your audio to work after. So we'll come back to Rich in just a second. But Lucy, I'll kick it over to you to talk about your experience with Berkshire Art Center.
Great. Thank you, Robert. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lucy Castaldo, Executive Director of Berkshire Art Center, which is formerly known as IS-183 Art School. Berkshire Art Center is a nonprofit community art school in Berkshire County. Since 1991, we've been growing and sustaining local artists through education, events, and exhibitions. We offer classes in the visual arts year-round for all ages and skill levels, including after-school programs in the area public schools. Slide, Robert. So our main studios are located in the historic Citizens Hall in Stockbridge, which was built in 1870. We also recently opened a satellite location in Pittsfield, which we won't talk about. Providing artists with space and specialized equipment to explore a variety of artistic mediums is key to our mission. So naturally, our facility is critical to our operations. Our Stockbridge building features a fully equipped ceramic studio, a dedicated studio for 2D exploration like painting and drawing, and we recently expanded our upstairs studio from a multi-use space to dedicated studios for printmaking and fiber arts. Slide. So why do we engage in the Systems Replacement Plan? We know the importance of our facility to our mission and our responsibility as stewards of a historic space. But we were largely operating without a comprehensive facilities plan and no staff dedicated to facilities management, just like Robert was saying earlier. So for our organization, that led to responding to issues as they emerge and deferred maintenance. I chose the most dramatic picture here from the start of our SRP process, but I'm sure you can all understand the negative impact of day-to-day decision-making. We needed exactly what the SRP provides, 20-year plan for repairs, replacements, and enhancements. It lived up to my expectation that it would be extremely valuable. Just to speak a bit about our process, which hopefully illustrates what Robert and Joe just went through. After an information gathering process, we met with Joe, the engineer, to come out to visit our site, and he conducted a thorough assessment of our building envelope and its systems. It wasn't just informative, it was educational. Considering we hadn't had a previous plan or a dedicated team, we really needed a lot of that information, just like Joe was talking about, going around and looking at the labels for specific pieces of equipment. All that information gathering is really important to make educated decisions. They then delivered the SRP tool, which gave costs to each of these projects. The next step was working with Robert and the tool to estimate timing for the projects, as he just discussed. The end result was a plan of when we would complete each project and how much it would cost annually. Next slide. But hopefully for all of you, like a strategic plan, the SRP is not something you complete once and then just look at every few years. It's intended to be a tool, and for us, it fit perfectly into our existing systems. We use a database system called Airtable, and we were able to easily integrate the SRP tool into the system that we use every day, which is what's pictured here. I think the main value for this work is that it's forever fluid. We can easily see which projects are coming up and make educated decisions about moving work or grouping projects together. And frankly, it can be easy to push off a project, but the tool also helps you visualize the impact of delaying work. We had plans to apply to the Massachusetts Cultural Council Cultural Facilities Fund, so we intentionally completed the SRP first in order to determine the best projects to move forward with and to show the grantors we had an educated plan. So I'll conclude by giving an example of how we rather recently used the SRP for decision-making, applied for and received a CFF grant, and avoided undue costs. We learned that our chimney liner was deteriorating. Now, this was not explicitly in our plan, but the plan did include an assessment of replacing our oil burner and converting to propane. So both decisions were included in our plan and how much they would cost. Before jumping to replace the liner, knowing that our SRP stated that our oil burner was aging and would eventually need to be replaced, I was able to weigh the pros and cons of continuing with oil or moving to propane. We ultimately decided to convert to propane and apply for a CFF grant, grouping together two of our projects around energy efficiency. In our experience, the inflation calculator was incredibly accurate, and it allowed me to determine an appropriate budget for the project included in the grant. We were awarded the grant through CFF to convert to propane and replace our lighting fixtures. And we avoided an expensive repair for something that would just be obsolete when we were no longer using the oil burner. So I hope that this illustrates the type of thinking that SRP enables and the value of pursuing it. I'll also candidly share that after completing the SRP, I personally purchased a house and literally took the inspection report and formatted it into the same tool. So I'm truly passionate about this slide. Thank you so much, and don't hesitate to contact me directly if you have any questions about the process or how we've utilized it since. I'm really happy to share and talk through this with you.
Thanks so much, Lucy. Really appreciate all the different connections and that it's been helpful. It's always good to hear. Rich, can we kick it back to you and see if we can hear you now. Oh, and it looks like you're on mute, but then we might have it.
Might be a little technology challenged.
It works.
Is that better?
Yes, thank you so much.
Great. Okay, well, when Jay first explained the system replacement plan to me, it was the first I had ever heard of such a thing. It took me a while to wrap my head around it. And by the end of the conversation, I was very excited and realized that we wanted to do this. However, we didn't have a proposal in place. We were in between projects. So we went ahead and had the good fortune to have one of our staff members was married to a contractor who was looking for some volunteer work to do. And so she offered him the opportunity to help us with a systems replacement plan. So we gave him the tool that that Jay forwarded to us, and he started working on it. And we went in, did all that work that Joe was talking about, figuring out when everything was put into service. We purchased the building in 2000. It was built in 1960. So a lot of systems were needed to be replaced. So we knew that the service date was 2001 because the first thing we did and at that point was replace a lot of the failing systems. When the opportunity came around to apply for a Cultural Facilities Fund grant again, we did get the grant, and also that was the year they gave I think 6 or 7 SRP plan funding out with it. So we jumped at the opportunity to have our plan reviewed by Joe, and that was the first time I've met an engineer who could talk about every system in the building and give us information on everything. And he filled out a lot of gaps in our plan and broadened the plan. It was just a fabulous experience. We put together a facility committee. We had a project manager from one of the general contractors who had done some work for us in the past. He was volunteering on our facility committee. One of our former board members had helped us find this building, and he was a purchasing agent for one of the local corporations. So he was invested in this facility, and he knew a lot about cost and how to procure things. And then we had another volunteer who was a project manager for a corporation. She wasn't a construction person, but she managed all their facility projects. She was very knowledgeable as well. And that committee would review our plan twice a year for several years, and then we went to once a year. And now I'm in the process of retiring and turning over, among other things, this facility plan to the person who's replacing me. And she is planning to continue working with that facility committee. The interesting thing is a couple of things Joe mentioned. Our floors are coming up. They reached the end of their lifespan, so our vinyl floor tiles should be replaced based on the plan. But when you look at the final floor tiles, they're fine. And as Joe was saying, you don't have to do everything just on that schedule. But you have a plan in place. So we're thinking that there are other things that are coming up that are more important than that, and that might be something that we don't replace immediately because we don't see a problem with it at the moment. The other thing that when we purchased the building, the photo on the bottom left is the photo of the basement structure. When we purchased the building, there was about half that number of support columns in the building, but there were no problems. As a matter of fact, the first time I visited the building inspector was visiting to check on some additional columns he had required the previous owner to install. So I had the impression that the structure of the building was fine and the city was on top of it and everything was hunky-dory. The construction people who looked at the building with us when we were purchasing it agreed that the structure was fine. When Joe visited 20 years later, the structure was still fine and there were no problems. And then a few years after that, we started noticing a lot more cracking in the building and settling. Than one of the floors by one of our entrances had separated from the wall and was sinking about half an inch, which was quite alarming. So we brought in some contractors to take a look at it, reviewed it, and it turns out that we had about 16 feet of gap between our columns, and we had to, and they were sagging. It was too long, so we had a project that Sister joist on the joist there on the columns, and we added almost double the number of columns in the basement. So there was a part of our plan that seemed to be okay, and then something happened that it was not okay. But the good thing is that we knew how to deal with it, and now it's just part of our plan, and we have quite a good project getting this done. This is about a $600,000 project, getting this whole thing done. And the other thing that we've done with this project is we always put a 20% contingency, and we work hard on including everything that might be needed. We don't shy away from costing the project as accurately as possible, regardless of what it's going to cost. And the idea is that we know stuff's going to come up that nobody anticipated. That you can guarantee that. And we want to end the project with a healthy surplus. When we write our grants, we always say that if there's a surplus, our plan is to put it into our building reserve fund. And our capital grants, which occur about every 5 years or so, they have been the biggest source of funding for our building reserve fund. And right now, there's usually $30,000 to $40,000 in the reserve fund. Right now, there's $90,000 in our reserve fund. And that has saved us over the years many, many times when something smaller happens, $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000 project, and you have to fix it. You have to fix it now. You want that money in your reserve fund. So that. I'm just checking my notes to see I've covered everything. I think I've got everything there. I guess that's all I have to say about it. It was a fabulous experience. I thoroughly enjoyed the time Joe was in the building, and everything he had to say is still in our plan, and we're reviewing it as we go. Matter of fact, we're in the process of reviewing it right now, so the new leadership can figure out what their plan is for the next year to 3 in their capital planning.
Thank you so much, Rich. And I really just appreciate your ability to talk about both sort of using it over time, right? The history going back, but also the reality that no one can 100% predict the future. And so we do our best with it. We make sure we plan as much as possible. And then we go from there, like most things in life. One more thing I do just quickly want to mention, and then we're gonna turn over to your questions, and we're all going to be here. And so if you have questions for me, for Joe, for MCC, for Rich or Lucy, feel free to keep those in the chat. We're going to have a healthy amount of time for those questions. One thing I did want to just acknowledge is that we're in a little bit of a weird moment here, where this plan is intended to replace systems, right? And so at its base, right, we're talking about keeping buildings operating in the way they are today. We're also in a moment in which the reality of our planet, the reality of regulations is saying that we need to push beyond just replacing what we have, to moving into something new. And so as Joe was talking about, he's been really incredible in being able to really think about not only are we doing those replacements, but what kind of changes can we start to do, given his experience, given what you see coming down the pike, in making real improvements as opposed to replacements. That is not necessarily a core part to the service, but it's something that we hope to do. I did want to mention as a hint, although we're not quite there yet, that we are also hoping to bring in an additional partner to this work in the future, to really specifically, from an engineer's perspective, look at how do we decarbonize buildings, how do we green buildings. So that's something that we're hoping down the road to think about, both including the systems, potentially also including some information around how operating costs might change due to energy costs being different for different systems. So that's something to hint for the future, that once you have this initial process, we're hoping down the line there might be some additional availability to do that sort of project as well. So wanted to mention that here. So thank you again, everyone, who's shared so far. Miranda, I think you said you were going to keep tabs on the questions that are coming in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robert. Thanks, Rich, Lucy, and Joe. I'm going to open up the floor for questions. So if anybody has any, feel free to drop them into the chat, and I'll start at the top with the first one we received and just read them out loud. And if any of you or Jay want to chime in and try to answer some of these, please feel free to speak up. So the first question we received was from Adam Bright. He said that in 2011, they received an SRP grant. It was useful and great, but now my organization is much larger and have essentially completed most of the planned renovations already. Are we eligible for another SRP grant?
So, yeah, I would say someone can fill in. I would say you're eligible, Adam, because I know you've done a lot of, there's new buildings on the campus. There's new systems. So, so yeah, I would say, sure, come back in. It's been 12 years, right? Does that sound reasonable to the folks, to Joe and Robert, where after a 12-year period, time to take a good look again?
I would think so, in terms of mechanical equipment, for example, on roofs are halfway through their useful life if they were replaced 12 years ago. If they are they're coming to the end of their useful life, there's been a lot of improvements in materials and products out there. So yes, I think it would make sense. In terms of the new buildings, it provides a plan for each of the new buildings for the next 20 years. Very little immediate need, but probably it's helpful to budget for the new buildings over the next 20 years.
Okay, Adam had another question. He said that he heard it's possible to apply for an SRP grant in conjunction with a capital grant, and that he is also planning to apply for a $200,000 capital grant this year. Would we need to adjust that budget to include an SRP report? So the answer to that is no. The capital grant and the systems replacement plan grant are two separate applications. So you don't have to bundle them together. You can apply for both at once. They're two separate forms. We will be making these slides available after the session. Feel free to send me an email, and I'm happy to send it to you. It will also be sent to everybody who registered in advance. Are subleases allowed to apply?
So it depends. And why don't you get in touch with Miranda or I? We can talk about it. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, feel free to reach out to Jay or I, and we'll learn the specific details of your organization. Okay, so another question, new question from the Cabot. Oh, I'm so sorry. I almost skipped one. A question from Marie. Can we explain the match again? Sure. So all Cultural Facilities Fund grants have a one-to-one match requirement. In this case, for a systems replacement plan grant, let's say the total cost for your organization is $14,000. We can cover half of that cost with an $8,000 grant, and the remaining $8,000 would be up to you to come up with to cover the total cost. So that is how the match works. We can cover up to 50% of project costs at a max of $200,000 for a capital grant specifically. Okay, so back to the Cabot. If our org has just received funding through the MCC CFF grant, can we apply for the systems replacement plan grant, or do we need to wait a year? So if you just received a capital grant in the last round, there is a 1-year wait period. There is no wait period for planning grant recipients. However, we do require that prior grants are fully spent down and completed before coming back to reapply. From Kathleen, are CPC funds allowable as a match toward Cultural Facilities Fund grant? Yes.
And just to clarify, CPC is the Community Preservation Act money that is municipally sourced. So it depends on where you live if they have if they've passed the CPC.
Okay, from the Mahawi, we have a multi-year assessment with an engineer. Are we able to apply to have that assessment renewed? We renew it regularly and we pay each time. Is this grant appropriate for this kind of funding relief?
So with the SRP is going to be packaged in very much the same way that was described in this webinar. And if for any reason you didn't fully understand it, we can talk about that separately. But you can also apply for a planning grant, right? That you can do any number of things with. And some of them are the things we're talking about right now, like updating an existing capital needs assessment. You can certainly do that with the planning grant. But if you do apply for the SRP, what you'll get is this prepackaged, predetermined engineer with the guidance of Nonprofit Finance Fund to package the whole piece together. And I'll let Joe or Robert talk about if there's existing documentation on what's been done with the building. I would think that would certainly help them if you get an SRP, that would be part of the due diligence on their part to find out, what you've done already in the condition of the building. Joe, does that make sense?
Yeah, we've had that on a number of SRP inspections recently where it's been helpful. It's been helpful having an engineer's previous assessment, gives us placed in service dates. And we do our SRP independent of that. Then we go back and verify it and compare it. I found that in a recent one, when I went back to compare it, my numbers looked a little high. So I went into it in a little more depth. So where it really helped me was to double check my numbers and costs. Our scope was more expansive. Seemed like that engineering report was tailored towards certain components, not all the components, but it's very helpful.
Okay. So we have two questions that are quite similar from Leslie and Don. How is the SRP different from a historic structures report? And then Don wanted to echo that they also have a collections assessment for preservation report, which is partially about the building condition. So I think the question is, how is the SRP different from both of those products?
Can you read that question again?
Yeah, the
go
first
ahead.
First question is, how is the SRP different from a historic structures report? And how is it different from a collections assessment for a preservation report?
I honestly don't know.
I could take a stab at it. So this is not a collections assessment, right? So I'm not sure that was the question. This is as I think as the presentation has shown, and some of the examples with Rich and Lucy are that you're going to get. I don't use the term generic in a bad way. I mean, but you're getting like the HVAC, the mechanicals, the electrical, the life safety, the structural components of the building looked at. But a historic structures report is a lot more detailed, and it takes into consideration the historic nature of the materials, the windows, the clapboards, all of that. This is not a historic structures report. It's more of, like I said, more of a generic building capital needs assessment that can go across from a historic structure to, like Adam was just talking about, a building relatively new on the Double Edge campus.
Jay, I can touch on how I approach the SRP with respect to landmark and historic. I'd say 75% of what we've done in the past 5 to 7 years has been landmark or historic. Where we have challenges, handicap accessibility, we make recommendations. We also recommend that an ADA consultant be brought in to confirm whether or not it can be done, and also a landmark consultant if they're available. The other part of this, and I'll give you a small example, an envelope upgrade energy efficiency. The older buildings tend not to have insulation in the walls. We're recommending blown-in insulation from the inside. In terms of the woodwork, for example, on the exterior, we're pricing restoration. Windows, how they can be upgraded, how can we add to the energy efficiency and stay within the landmark and historic requirements. So we do address it from that perspective, but I wasn't familiar with those two reports.
Okay, thank you both. Next question from Erin. So they are a nonprofit, they own their own building, but the building is not operational yet because the systems need to be upgraded and the building needs to be renovated, which they are working toward. Would we still be applicable for this grant?
So this comes up a lot because I think the word systems replacement indicates that the grant may be to actually physically replace systems, but our emphasis here with this particular grant is the plan. So this is a replacement plan or a needs assessment without any of the implementation yet. We do have a capital grant, as Miranda has mentioned, that you can certainly apply to for the implementation and the build out of systems. So, but this is a planning grant.
I would also offer there, because this has also come up a few times, that this is really meant for those sort of regular kind of replacements over time. You know, like Jay was just saying, as a generalist, right? Thinking through what are the pieces we should be considering, as opposed to if we need real renovations, make things new, kind of starting from scratch. And so come and talk to us, talk to Jay, talk to Miranda. You know, every situation is a little bit different, but it tends to be where folks are for the first time approaching a brand new project. They're looking for more design services as opposed to, again, thinking just about what would need over time. I would say that we've worked with a number of folks right after major renovation projects to, again, think about what their repair and replacement needs are going to be over time once that initial sort of revamp is done as well.
Okay, question from Brooke. Could we apply for an SRP on a building we have not acquired yet, but that we will own by June 2024?
You would have to have some ownership or title to the building before the grant during the review process. The application deadline is December. We do sometimes have a grace period for legal documentation. So for example, getting a building under ownership or 501c3 designation, but I think June would be too late. You should probably wait until next round.
Okay. The Icon Museum says we have solar panels on our roof. Would they be included in the assessment?
Yes. I've gotten more and more. To give everybody a little bit of background on us, we are also owners reps in the construction industry. And with the heavy push to energy efficiency, we're very well versed in a lot of the new mechanical equipment, solar, et cetera. So yes, we do provide an assessment for replacement of the solar. Or sometimes we'll even add it as for consideration.
Okay. Question from Brad. We have very few systems, no heat or water. Can we use this grant to help us plan adding systems that don't exist yet? Like water, heat, or septic?
I haven't encountered this. I mean, we did have one potential SRP discussion with a client that had similar requests. I think the issue with that is going to be, we're going to recommend bringing in a mechanical engineer. We could make recommendations, but we're just estimating. So it's probably not, it doesn't make sense at this point.
Yeah, we do have a planning grant. It's called Feasibility and Technical Assistance Grant. It goes up to 35,000. And you can use that to design new systems, expansions to buildings, et cetera. Can I just add one thing, Miranda? I would also say, on the topic of, super energy efficient, high performing buildings that are getting away from carbon and more electrified. If you want to do a deep dive into that, we do have the feasibility grant once again can be used for that. And if you do that, you should talk to Miranda and I, because just to sort of circle back on how we can best build out products and assessments to reflect some of the regulations coming in. Municipalities now are starting to implement sort of met benchmarks to decarbonize or electrify the buildings. And then, of course, the first step sometimes is just making the buildings more efficient. So if you do go down that path, we certainly welcome that type of an application in our feasibility and technical assistance application.
Thanks, Jay. Another question from Dora. Since many of our buildings are one of a kind and even on the National Register, do you come up with tailored costs for furniture, assets, etc., and not just replacement costs for, quote, normal replacements?
No, just building components. The reason, and I saw a question here earlier about theater equipment, theater lighting. We don't know, it's a specialty, so we don't normally get involved with that.
Okay, from Jennifer. I would love to understand the sequence and the application process with MCC, Olive Consulting and NFF, and how the planning fee is determined and at what stage in the process.
So the application for the SRP is kind of like an intake form. We ask about, the size of the building, the use of the building, number of bathrooms. We ask, and from that, we send that to the team at NFF, and they get back to us and tell us where we are in that range between $8,000 and $14,000 as the grant. So that's the way it's being done right now, because we have to get info from you before we can actually tell you what this assessment is going to cost. So the range is between 8,000 and 14,000, and once you fill that out, the deadline will pass, and then we will get back to you with the number that we came up with in relationship to the info you gave us.
If I could jump in and just speak to a little bit more, because I know folks are saying, well, that's a huge range for us. And so some of really what goes into it, it's the size of the building and the number of buildings. Those are the two biggest. So if it's a small building, the assessment's going to take a lot less time. The input and the process is going to take a lot less time. And then again, as Joe was talking about before, when there are multiple buildings involved, there will be multiple reports, one for each of those buildings. And so that's where the biggest flux in price goes. The other thing that can affect it is just how much documentation is available and included as part of that application. If you've had one of these assessments recently and a lot of it's already there, it's going to take a lot less time for some of the other pieces. So those are the three pieces, the biggest one being the size of the building and the number of buildings.
Great, thank you. Okay, Brad says, we know we need a lot of work on our building envelope. I understand that the SRP will help us plan all that and will help our board plan. Do we also need further work, like construction estimates, before we can apply for a capital grant?
So you can apply for a capital grant with estimates, with bids. The estimates can come from an architect. They can come from an educated guess on your part. So just send us what you have, and we'll make some sort of determination of how that sits in relationship to all the other applications that come in, because there is a little bit of an emphasis on funding projects that are closer to implementation than those that are 1 or 2 years out. So it's hard to give you a definitive answer, but just basically send us what you have by the deadline, which is December 14th. And if you can secure more definitive costs between now and then, you certainly do that.
Okay, I think we might have answered the next two questions, but just quickly, just to make sure I didn't miss them. Bob Stoneham asked, will the assessment include auditorium equipment such as rigging, hoists, stage, lighting, etc.? Joe, I think you answered this and that it was a no.
That's correct.
Thank you.
It's a specialty.
You can use the feasibility and technical assistance grant for that.
Absolutely.
I
Okay.
actually have to jump off for a 3:30 if that's okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you so much,
You're
Joe.
welcome. Thank you, everyone. This was great, by the way.
Thanks.
Thank you, Joe.
I'm also unfortunately going to have to hop off, but really just wanted to say thank you everyone for being here, participating. We are available if you follow up. Our email is included in the presentation, which will be shared. So really appreciate everyone's time. Miranda, Jay, I'm not sure if you're able to stay. Or if
We'll
you
stick
wanna wrap up.
around. Yeah, we'll stick around and answer some questions.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, Robert.
Take care, everyone.
Okay, so we'll do our best to get through the rest of these questions. So Brooke asked, can we apply for multiple buildings? The answer is yes. Kathy says, our campus includes 4 buildings and a lighthouse tower. Understanding the consultant may not be able to do an SRP on the lighthouse tower, are we still eligible to apply for the other buildings on the campus? Same answer, yes. Is the consultation with NFF included in the SRP grant? Yes. So they produce the report and then walk you through everything. Adam, having completed an SRP grant process and then using it in our renovations plan, we found it very useful for the existing and what was assessed. But we got more distance from the report the more we invested in either new renovations and or alterations to buildings. Especially the projection of costs got messed up. I wonder if we missed certain training or ways to incorporate growth to facilities into a plan.
You know what? We can package that question and get that to NFF, because it sounds like, if I'm hearing it right, there maybe needs some components of the spreadsheet that you needed to unlock to update costs. But Adam, I think it's a great question. And if we could explore that a little more and ask NFF if there's an answer to that.
That sounds good. Okay, another question from Brad. I missed some of the process. We apply, some wait time before we hear back from the MCC. Process starts. I couldn't tell how long after hearing from the MCC before work starts. Okay, so just a quick overview of the process. Application deadline is Thursday, December 14th. Grants are announced by mid-May 2024. And then there is some time before you can get started. The very first step is having to raise the matching funds. Now, SRP grant recipients have 1 year to raise the match, and that's the very first step. So once the match is in hand, you can start working with Mass Development to enter into a grant contract, and you'll provide evidence that you have the matching funds raised. And then once you begin working with NFF, I believe Robert said it's usually about a 3-month period or that the process takes place within. So you're kind of working on your own individual timeline when it comes to raising the match to get to that point. But once you begin working with NFF, it's about 3 months. Sandy is asking, how do you determine the amount to apply for?
That's on you fill out the SRP application, and it will let you know what the range is between 8,000 and 14,000 once we send it back to NFF to let us know how much the assessment will cost.
Yeah, and roughly it's based on the square footage of your facility. There is a chart in the application form that will give you a rough idea of what you should be asking for. There's a space where you can enter the grant amount requested. But like Jay said, once we take a look at the information, we'll have a more precise idea of what the total cost of the plan is. And there was the very next question was asking about that as well. Yes, the total cost includes the consultation with NFF and the assessment, which is the physical plan. Okay, from Deborah, can we apply for more than one of the applications that are open, or do we have to select only one? So you do have to choose one but there are a couple of exceptions. The first being, you can apply for a systems replacement plan grant in tandem with a capital grant or a feasibility grant. So you can't apply for feasibility and capital at the same time, but you can couple an SRP grant with either one of those two. The second exception is you can apply for a feasibility and technical assistance grant in tandem with a capital grant or a systems replacement plan grant if it is for the purpose of decarbonization, green energy, or energy efficiency. From Alicia, do you help connect with local contractors for recommended projects?
No, it's kind of up to you to do the due diligence with either the design team or the contractor. So we can't really be selecting people to do the work. That's part of the thing we assess is your ability to identify builders and designers and getting the appropriate documentation to demonstrate that you've engaged in that process.
Okay, a note from CJ, just some confusion about the process. So he says, I'm a bit confused since this entire grant program is called the Systems Replacement Plan. Is the planning grant you're referring to part of this same grant program or just a specific phase or something else? So maybe you can just back up. So the Cultural Facilities Fund program offers 3 types of grants. The first being capital, which goes up to $200,000. This can cover the costs of renovations, expansion, new construction, and new equipment. It can pay for the costs of doing that work. A planning grant, or in other words, a feasibility and technical assistance grant, is a grant for planning exercises, feasibility studies, capital campaign feasibility studies, designs, etc. The third grant, which is the focus of this presentation, is the Systems Replacement Plan grant. So the SRP grant covers half the cost of the plan itself, of the Systems Replacement Plan, which is a tool, it is a planning document. I hope that helped. And if not, message Jay or I with any follow-up questions. Next is from Gretchen. Do you have dates on which awards will be announced? How quickly can one begin work if awarded a capital grant? So I think we answered both of these already, but just a reminder. So grants are announced in May of 2024. And if you receive a capital grant, the very first step is to raise the match. So capital grant recipients have 2 years to raise the match. And once you have the match in hand, then you can get started entering into contract and prepare for the disbursement of the
I'll
funds.
just add one additional piece to that. If you're applying for a capital grant, the start date of the work cannot precede September 1st, 2023. So you're applying now, it's November 2023, and the work started in October 1st, it's okay, even though we won't have grant awards until mid-May. September 1st, 2023 is the start date for any work to be eligible for this round of funding.
Question from Sandy Curry. Is it for buildings only? We have ships.
You mean the SRP is for buildings only? Let's, if you could email us that question. I don't know if Joe, I don't think he's a boat, builder, so that it may not work, but we could, you can use the feasibility and technical assistance grant for that, and we have done so, because that's like theater equipment. That's a specialty that I don't think Joe has. So I think instead of emailing him the question, I'm pretty sure It's a specialty item of SHIPS in that you should apply for the feasibility and technical assistance grant.
Okay, another question from Don. Is there a fee upfront to do the SRP, and what is the match expected for? So the fee per se, it's not really a fee, it's the match. The match is the very first step, so that needs to be in hand before you begin the process, and the match covers half of the cost of the plan. And so for a $14,000 systems replacement plan, as an example, the grant, if you received a grant of $8,000, that would cover half of the cost of the plan, and your match would cover the remaining half.
I think the easiest way to look at it is if you look at any grant from the Cultural Facilities Fund, that is half the cost of the project. So in other words, if it's an $8,000 SRP, it's a $16,000 project, right?
I've been doing my math wrong
It's
since my
okay. I
presentation.
think the idea is getting across. So like if we say a capital grant, you get $100,000 capital grant, you've got at least a $200,000 budget because everything is a one-to-one match. And sometimes that gets a little confusing in the conversation. And like I said, the feasibility and technical assistance grants go up to $35,000. If you get a $35,000 feasibility grant, you have at least a $70,000 project, right? So that's a constant. So once again, with the SRPs, if it's between $8,000 and $14,000, it's a $16,000 to $28,000 product you're buying. So.
Thank you, Jay.
Make a point here that people might find helpful? In the last grant that we did, the foundations told us, two foundations told us that they awarded us the grant on the condition that we got the cultural facilities grant. So their award was conditional, and then of course we let cultural facilities know immediately that we had these grants. That were conditional on their awarding this grant, so which I think was probably in our favor. But the foundations look at the cultural facilities funding very carefully.
Thanks, Rich. Okay, from Paul. Paul's asking for more detail on the timeline from notification of the grant award to meeting with Olive Branch Consulting. So we have signed one agreement and we have our match. We are waiting for the next step from Mass Development, I believe. So it sounds like, Paul, you've already been a recipient of a systems replacement plan grant. I think that we can get in touch with you, or feel free to reach out to us and we can connect you to Mass Development if that's where you are at in your specific process. From Anne, we rent our building from our city. Can we apply for our building, and to what extent does the city need to be involved in the process of applying for the grant?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's, if you're leasing a building, most of these systems that we talk about and that you saw in the presentations, both with Lucy and Rich, is they do everything in the building. It's the HVAC, it's the structural, it's the roof. So if you're leasing, in most cases, you're not responsible for all of that. So we're not going to do the assessment for another entity. We're here to sort of work with nonprofits. Now, municipalities are eligible, so there could be a path forward with this one, and you should get in touch with us. But generally speaking, this is for entities that own the buildings, or per the terms of their lease are responsible for all these types of things we're talking about.
Okay, from Megan. If one applies for and receives a capital grant this December, but not an SRP, when would they next be eligible to apply for an SRP? Trying to understand and make sure I understand the 1-year wait period. So Megan, if you apply for a capital grant this December and you are awarded one next May 2024, you would need to observe a 1-year wait period before being eligible to come back and reapply. Also on the condition that your capital grant is fully drawn down. So if you're awarded a capital grant in May of 2024, the next cycle that you would be eligible to apply for and receive a grant in would be 2026, or by a December 2025 deadline date. From Gretchen, can one send out an RFP for a systems replacement plan prior to signing a contract with Mass Development? So this product is conducted with and by the Nonprofit Finance Fund and Olive Branch Consulting. You do not need to identify your own contractor for this grant. We take care of that for you. Okay, from Dawn, we are in the process of implementing an SRP. Is it feasible to apply for a capital grant this year? Yes. Certainly. And I think that's it. So we've gone through all of the questions. Thank you all for joining. We hope you found the presentation useful. This will be available on the Mass Cultural Council's YouTube page within the next week, and we can make the slides from the PowerPoint available as well. We're happy to share those via email. If anyone has any questions about the SRP grant or any other Cultural Facilities Fund grant, or about writing your application, any application questions, contact Jay or I. Again, deadline is Thursday, December 14th. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Shanice. Thank you, Iris, for the interpretation. Very much appreciate it. Have a good afternoon, everyone, and good Thanksgiving.
Thank you all so much.